Original Moms for Liberty, the OGs. Ever heard of the John Birch Society? Didn't think so. It was a far-right group founded in the 60s by Massachusetts candy maker John Welsh, in which members were referred to as Birchers. Motion to start calling Moms for Liberty folks Birchers. Do I have a second?
Welcome to Unraveling Education, the podcast that's part storytelling, part information, and part whodunit. We'll be investigating the underlying issues harming the public education system and identifying the key players involved.
Hey there, I'm Danielle Ford, former trustee of the Clark County School District, which includes Las Vegas, Nevada, making it the 5th largest district in the country. It's back to school season, which makes it the perfect time to binge read The Education Wars, the new book by journalist Jennifer Berkshire and education scholar Jack Schneider. They host an amazing podcast called Have You Heard?, which you can find links to in the description or search for it on the podcast platform of your choice. This book binge will be a mixture of me reading directly from the book, me paraphrasing some of it, my own notes, and of course, my thoughts and amusing anecdotes. This episode will cover the long history of attempted banning of books, what Moms for Liberty really is and who's behind them, the current obsession with transgender policies, the why behind anti-CRT initiatives, and the real agenda that's propelling all the chaos surrounding public education in America. Finally, we will end with proven tactical methods to fight back against the culture wars and share examples of communities that have been successful at reclaiming their public schools. Before we get started, you can connect with me on social media. Look up Unraveling Education on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, or Trustee Ford on X. Please share this podcast with your friends, and if you would like to support the show, please do so at unravelingeducation.com/sponsor. The book opens with an introduction explaining that in 2023, a state of emergency was declared by Roy Cooper, governor of North Carolina. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a series of bills that were getting approved by state legislators whose campaigns had been backed by extreme right-wing groups like Moms for Liberty. Governor Cooper warned that these bills, if passed, would set our schools back a generation, and that it was clear that the aim was to, quote, choke the life out of public education, end quote. Education Wars explores what those bills and policies are, what the real goals and agendas behind them are, and how they've been successful in getting communities to support them, despite them being what the majority of people on both sides of the political line actually want. In other words, lots of concerned and caring people are being tricked into doing their evil bidding. But not all hope is lost. While the majority of the Education Wars provides a full picture of public education and the impending doom, if these people are not stopped, it also lays out steps and best practices for communities to fight back. Now let's start at page 8, chapter 1, What's at Stake and Why Should Anyone Care? In January 2023, an attack was launched on LGBTQ students through a proposed Don't Say Gay bill. Donald Trump's former White House aide, Stephen Miller, launched an organization called America First Legal, and he spent $9 million on ads and messaging to get people angry about issues that they never cared about before, erode trust in public education as a whole as a way to justify privatization. But student activists organized. The Georgia Youth Justice Coalition engaged in a strategy consisting of a series of op-eds in newspapers, letter writing campaigns, and conversations with voters to inform them that we explain to people that, hey, this is how much money they're taking from your school and telling you that it's because schools are full of gay kids. The students were successful in stopping the bills that had passed in other states. So to summarize, $9 million in messaging was spent to get everybody upset about sex ed curriculum and inclusive books in schools. The solution to that was a Don't Say Gay bill that was really a trick to push for vouchers, school vouchers. Page 9. What's so great about public education anyway? This portion goes into the fact that public education is actually something of a marvel. Public education is intended to be equal. Adequacy doesn't sound inspiring, but it is. The problem is that people want excellence and they are outraged when it's not that. But to provide adequate education for all kids, regardless of parents' race or income or whether they have parents at all, or if the student was born here or brought here hear or if they have physical or intellectual disabilities is impressive, especially considering what education was in the past. Page 10 through 19 gives a background of American education. I'm going to take this opportunity to promote the Unraveling Education episode called The History of School Boards. It covers this thoroughly and, in my biased opinion, hilariously. But it is focused on school boards because that's the part of this whole thing that gives the power to the people. So I suggest that you check that out, but definitely don't watch if you hate Hamilton or cats. Or people singing that cannot carry a tune. The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by being a lot smarter, by working a lot harder, by being a self-starter. Alexander Cattleton. What? The quick version of these pages is that the early American education was basically just rich kids having private tutors and private schools with everyone else's kids attending pauper schools. Pauper schools offered the bare bones and sent an important message of this is all you get. This is the education you deserve, and this is the education we deserve. Early education advocates for a long time advocated for schools to be fair to everyone, and then what came next were common schools, which would serve everyone equally. They would be public infrastructure and paid for by tax dollars like everything else, roads, parks, and running water. Not everyone thought the new system was fair, though. Still excluded from common schools were African American and Mexican American students, as well as students with disabilities. The American education system that we have today absolutely has room for improvement to be truly fair, especially in regards to students in rural and low-income areas, but the gradual shift to state financing has made it fairer. Page 11 asks, but does it work? And then it goes into public education can't fix all of our social and economical problems by itself, but a more or less universal program that we all pay for and that is open to everyone has resulted in a country that is far more equal than it was in the past or when compared to other countries. Page 12 continues with, few of us have ever made the case that our schools have too many resources or that the facilities have gotten a bit too posh, or how engaging the curriculum is, and nobody's gossiping about the exciting things that teachers are doing. On page 14, you'll learn that for most of U.S. history, teachers received no training. Education was a grab bag. Students brought whatever they had at home. Page 15 continues to explain that for the past 50 years, we've burdened the schools with an unrealistic expectation that they would solve the problem of economic equality. Beginning in the 1970s, both Democrats and Republicans began making the case that the primary purpose of education was to prepare people for jobs which would address the nation's deepening wealth gap. Democrats especially pushed the narrative that a rising educational tide would lift all boats and expand the middle class without politicians having to have tough conversations and deal with difficult things like wealth distribution. Schools were going to do that for them. They were basically hyped as this amazing solution to solve inequality. But then when they didn't do that, when they didn't, solve all the world's problems, people were disappointed. And that cycle of elevated expectations and inevitable disillusionment has left public schools vulnerable to public attack, which they'll cover more in the next chapter. Page 16 explains that narrowing the purpose of schooling to job training has undermined the broader civic purpose of education. Public education brings us all together. It brings us together by ensuring that, to some extent, our fortunes are bound together. Personally, I think that's beautiful, but like the authors state, that's often presented as a bug in the system rather than a feature, with parents being encouraged to only care about their children and no one else's. Before we go on, if you are watching on YouTube, I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on this. Leave a comment and let me know if you are more of a our fortunes are bound together mindset or a my child deserves more than other children mindset. Regardless of opinion, the origins of public education and the rationale behind the universal system is clear, and it was understood by all that the only way public schools would succeed was if there was broad buy-in, and that's why education went from private schools serving the rich and pauper schools serving the poor to the forming of common schools to serve everyone. Page 18 explains that founders like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson agreed that, quote, government has a responsibility to every rank and class of people, down to the lowest and the poorest, and a duty to pay for that education at public expense. Page 19 goes into that public education was expanding. A sense of shared community could be felt, but the argument for intentional integration of race and class didn't emerge until the civil rights movement. Residential segregation seriously limited the actual racial and economical diversity of schools. This book doesn't go much further into residential segregation, but you can look up redlining for a deeper understanding, or even better, I suggest that you watch the documentary called 13th on Netflix. And here's a notable quote from Justice Thurgood Marshall. "Unless our children begin to learn together, there is little hope that they will ever begin to live together." Boom. Page 20, the subheading Principles and Practices explains that it's easy to point to high-minded principles when defending public education. If you're an advocate, these are probably your main talking points right now. You probably say that public education is a pillar of democracy. Probably say that public schools serve all kids equally, while charters and private can turn kids away. But there are also operational characteristics of the public education system worth defending. For instance, democratic control. Local schools belong to local communities. Even though communities might disagree and even be hostile, and school boards can be dysfunctional, local governance is far more responsive and influenced by the community than the next layer of authority, which is the state. In states where they have lost their ability to elect their local school board members, at that point, everyone in the community fights hard to get it back. They say once schools cease to belong to their communities, the case for their existence, including the willingness to pay for them, gets harder to make. The next argument is transparency. Americans collectively spend around $1 trillion each year on K-12 public schools. They say once you eliminate transparency, the potential for financial abuse becomes enormous. The next one is that kids become more vulnerable. There are laws around reporting and bullying, and sometimes they aren't followed, sure, but they exist. There are public record laws, there are open meeting laws, and I can personally attest to this from my experience on the Clark County School Board. Because of these laws, many things come to light that wouldn't come to light had they not existed. I can't tell you the things I know about because they become lawsuits and then they're confidential, but then sometimes those lawsuits become public and it gives everyone a reason to advocate against public schools when the only reason that we found out was because of the laws to protect kids. Meanwhile, there are cases of sexual abuse happening in private schools, often religious schools, for years and years and years because there was no mandatory transparency. Personally, especially after what I witnessed with the pandemic, I think all the time about the kids that are being homeschooled and they're not living in a picture-perfect environment, but now the parent doesn't have to send their kid to school with bruises. Teachers are often the ones who notice and report signs of abuse in children. The next operational argument is data. Private schools and nonprofits control their own data. In theory, they're supposed to follow the same state standards, but they don't, and there's no one holding them accountable or checking that public, charter, and private and homeschool students are being compared by the same metrics. Next, public schools are staffed by professionals. Charter and private schools can be, but they also cannot be. There is no floor to ensure a baseline of competence. The authors state, "The future we're rushing into is one which regulation is thrown out the window." Page 24, and this subheading is the most important part of this whole book, in my opinion. If we lose our schools, they're not coming back. Let's say that again. If we lose our schools, they're not coming back. The chapter continues, 2 centuries ago, and which is only like your great-great-grandma, teachers didn't need any more education than the grade level that they were teaching, because there wasn't much sorting based on levels of knowledge going on. There were no curriculum standards. What students learned was arbitrary. The school calendar was half of what it is now, and students would not attend for long periods of time, and it was just like, oh well, because attendance didn't matter. And literally nobody thinks that schools are operating perfectly right now. Like, you're not going to find a student, a parent, an educator, a politician, or a public education advocate that will say, the education system that we have today is perfect. Let's just leave it alone. But some people are saying, let's fix it, while others are saying, let's burn it to the ground. The problem isn't that schools are failing. In fact, they're significantly better than it was for your great-great-grandma. The problem is that schools are slow to change. And all of that is explained on page 24. 50 million students attend around 100,000 schools. The authors say that's too ambitious. Schools and educators are not producing widgets. They're trying to cultivate the development of well-rounded people. There's no quick fix. There's no simple solution. There's no hack. Now imagine trying to start from scratch today. How well do we think that would go? Rebuilding from the ground up in a way that everybody agrees with? Nobody can agree on anything. Politicians argue the most simple of items endlessly. Outraged parents scream for hours about bathrooms. Imagine having to come up with a whole new system entirely while there isn't one anymore. I'm usually a very burn it to the ground type person, and even I can see that that would be impossible. But that is the point. The current school wars are driven and inflamed by groups that aren't outraged by bathrooms. They're outraged by the very existence of public education. The next chapter starts on page 26, chapter 2, called Why Are We Always Fighting About Schools? Now, here's the first mention in the book about government schools. I'm sure you've heard this phrase thrown around. It was made popular from the book Battle for the American Mind by Fox News correspondent Pete Hegseth. The main idea of the book is that evil liberals are using public education to make kids hate America and hate themselves, especially white kids. According to this guy, teachers in classrooms are saying, you should be ashamed because you're white. Also, America is bad. Also, you know what you should do? Be gay. And then just, anything that the Bible says, just do the opposite of that. Here are some phrases from reviews that will sound familiar if you've listened to public comments at school board meetings. I have not read this book yet, but it seems to be like some sort of manifesto or a Bible or something. Here's some reviews. It is time to rethink the importance of education and bring it back under the lordship of Christ. Much of the compromise we see in the church can be traced to how we educate our children. This work pulls back the veil to reveal the sinister agenda of progressive education and prescribes a little-known antidote that will, with the grace of our Lord, have a real impact on the future of our kids. That's John MacArthur. And now, next one. Pete Hegseth is a patriot, and as such, he is unwilling to abandon the educational system to the predations of the militant left. In Battle for the American Mind, Hegseth lays out the state of play, how far our education system is, and what we can do to take it back. That's Ben Shapiro. And lastly, if you want your civilization to continue, few things matter more than what your children learn in school. Our kids are learning to hate the society our ancestors built. Pete Hegseth has seen it, and in this book, he's got a solution. That's Tucker Carlson. Page 27, subheading reads, We fight about schools because it's a convenient way to fight about other things. Pages 27 through 32 explain that the goal is to make people paranoid about schools. Most people don't know what's happening at schools, and that makes it easy to peddle half-truths, distortions, and straight-up lies, passing them off as expose journalism. Claims are always around that teachers have become extremists, children are faced with imminent harm, and the fate of the nation lies in the balance. An essay written in 1864 includes paranoid leaders rally support for their political causes by alleging vast conspiracy theories that threaten cherished ways of living. For example, the teaching of evolution. Now here's a quick propaganda timeline, okay? So in 1922 through 1929, anti-evolution bills banning the teaching of any nefarious matter in public schools existed. It was, my cats are insane. Dear God. Okay. It was any theory that denies the existence of God, that denies the divine creation of man, or teaches atheism or infidelity, or contains vulgar, obscene, or indecent matter should be banned. In the 1930s, educators were framed as a threat. The progressive social studies instruction history textbooks would, quote, indoctrinate the pupil with collective ideas and make school teachers indoctrinates of a new social doctrine. There's a lot of doctrines. Oh my goodness. In 1940s and 1950s, the claim was that schools were serving as seedbeds for communism. Conservative groups published pamphlets that stated, they want your children. And how red are the schools? Joseph McCarthy, famous for communist hunts in Washington and Hollywood, announced that he'd go into the education system and expose all the communists and the communist thinkers. In the 1970s, Save Our Children campaign, it was against homosexuals working with children. The campaign stated that because homosexuals can't reproduce, they have to recruit. To freshen their ranks, they're targeting the youth. That is a quote. In the 1980s, religious conservative groups were claiming secular humanism in schools and that textbooks were undermining religion and family. Their examples were objectionable teachings like equal treatment of religions other than Christianity and non-standard family relationships and the portrayal of women in non-traditional roles should all be banned. And the common theme among all the propaganda is always that the children are at risk. And on the flip side, during all of this, civil rights activists wanted books banned as well. They wanted racist books banned. So none of this is new to anybody, but most banning efforts were not about the things that have always been challenged to whatever degree for that time period. The majority has always been driven by religious conviction. For instance, the effort to restrict the teaching of the theory of evolution. They wanted to restrict any religion other than Christianity, any profanity like damn, any blending of fantasy with reality, and any creating child characters who failed to respect religion should be banned from those books should be banned. Page 35 goes into that school battles are often about the expansion of civil rights. Scratch beneath the surface of the recent school culture wars and you'll find a common thread, the pace of social change. The reactionary panics about what students are learning and the claims that parental rights are being violated are intended to not just slow down progress, but to roll it back altogether. So then what I'm taking from this is that the more equal schools become, the more opposition there's always going to be. Like, we just need to accept that. Page 37 goes into that school battles are also about power. A Moms for Liberty member in Colorado was quoted on camera saying, "There is a high-level conspiracy involving teachers' unions, the President of the United States, and deep-pocketed donors to turn more kids gay and trans." When pushed to explain the purpose of the conspiracy, she quickly responded, "Because it breaks down the family unit, which breaks down conservative values." So my impulse is to roll my eyes at this, except the book once again explains that every time education progresses, a claim is put in parents' ears that it's going to weaken the family and parental authority. So once again, none of this is new. Page 38, in 1924, after it became mandatory for kids to attend kindergarten, a dad complained about the government outreach, and I quote, "Even my youngster in kindergarten is telling us where to get off. He won't even eat white bread because he says they tell him at kindergarten that brown is more healthful." I think we all know one of these types. Now, at the heart of all of these disputes is always the age-old question. Who calls the shots over policies that affect our children? Is it the parents or is it the state? Both families and schools transmit values, and they're not always the same. Schools, after all, are where we expect young people to learn to think for themselves, even if that's not what parents want them to think. Page 41. We fight about schools because that's where we place our expectations. The school culture war era we're in began in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik. When needing a reason for the Russians sending a satellite to space before America and winning in the space race, political leaders saw an easy target: the schools. Our education system, they explained, just wasn't keeping up with the rest of the world. That seed was planted, and then 25 years later, a report called A Nation at Risk sprouted. Crafted and released by the Reagan administration, giving birth to the failing schools narrative, the report became a mega hit in political circles. You got things to say too? Okay, let's hear it. What do you got to say? Equality for cats in schools. Okay, now you talk? Okay. Page 42 basically explains that Reagan lit the match on this whole thing, and every president since on both sides has thrown gas on the fire and fanned the flames. Now armed with proof of schools failing, they were all able to grandstand and make big promises about education, and they were all going to be the heroes. By the way, it was revealed later that the data in A Nation at Risk was majorly skewed by the commission that authored it, but nobody that's made all these decisions that impacted education since then wants to talk about that, because they'd have to admit that systems and policies and companies, etc., that have been created since then are clearly not the solution, and a lot of them are still being heavily used, like assessment companies and canned curriculum and standardized testing. But I digress. After Reagan, George H.W. Bush declares that during his campaign for president that he's going to be the nation's first education president. After winning, he began making the case that only higher standards could rescue our failing schools. Bill Clinton comes in, he doubles down on that. We must demand more and more and more from our schools. George W. Bush enters and he takes the baton from Clinton. Schools are still failing by the standards that they're being judged with, and now Bush is going to be the one to finally make schools succeed in his eyes. The plan? Make a law that says they better do better or else. That is No Child Left Behind. Barack Obama gets elected, promising radical change. Those promises fall very short regarding education. He continues the same rhetoric, even calling schools dropout factories and blaming it on the teachers that aren't doing a good job. Page 43 explains, to put simply, bemoaning the state of our schools and promising education reforms that would solve a variety of economic and social problems had simply become part of the president's job description. Of all the problems that education is supposed to solve, poverty is the most ambitious. It's a massive social and economic project dropped at the doorstep of our schools. In turn, resentment about economic inequality has been directed at the education system. And as inequality has grown wider in recent decades, political leaders in both parties continue insisting that more or better education is the answer. The result of outsized expectations for what schools can accomplish in this country is an outsized disappointment when they fail to deliver. The entire project of free, taxpayer-supported, democratically run public schools hangs in the balance, yet there is no collective roar of outrage of what we stand to lose. Chapter 3. Why are we fighting about schools now? This chapter opens that at the 2023 Moms for Liberty National Summit, former President Donald Trump painted a dire portrait of the nation's schools. The education system, he warns, had been infested by Marxist lunatics and perverts. To rapturous applause, Trump lays out his plan to liberate our children by cutting federal funding to any school pushing inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. Such over-the-top rhetoric is par for the course these days. Ron DeSantis has branded American schools as cesspools of woke indoctrination. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that teachers' unions and the filth that they're teaching our kids will take this republic down, and versions of such claims reverberate on the campaign trail and throughout the right-wing media ecosystem, on cable channels, on internet news sites, and in best-selling books. Today's school culture wars carry distinct echoes of earlier battles over textbooks, sex education, and the teaching of evolution. And yet, and this is important, this time really is different. Americans are more divided in their opinions of public schools than in the past about the purpose of public education and who should be allowed to decide. The roaring return of the culture war in the schools has also accelerated the push for school privatization, threatening the very existence of public education. Page 46, subheading Deepening Divides, says, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the racial reawakening that followed, school curricula emerged as a pivotal issue on the right. High-ranking Republicans accused Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona of promoting activist indoctrination in public education that fixates solely on past flaws and splits our nation into divided camps. Americans, they wrote, never decided our children should be taught that our country is inherently evil. That message would quickly become a movement, launching a cascade of laws and new state and local policies aimed at shaping and limiting classroom discussions of race and other so-called divisive concepts. There's an example on page 47. In New Jersey, the schools in 2020 adopted a new mission statement crafted by a group of parents, teachers, and school counselors, pledging to provide a culturally responsive, critically engaging curriculum for students of all backgrounds. But the political winds had shifted dramatically, and in 2022, local voters propelled a slate of conservative candidates onto the school board. The candidates ran as proponents of parental rights, and they were backed by the 1776 Project PAC, one of a growing number of super PACs aimed at taking back the schools from what they characterize as a progressive education establishment. And they quote, "Activists, scholars, and politicians are currently attempting to socially engineer our society and its relation to race, racism, and power. The solution is reforming our public education system by promoting patriotism and pride in American history." A 2022 poll found that a vast gulf now separates Democrats from Republicans when it comes to their faith in public education. While 43% of Democrats express confidence in schools, fewer than 10% of Republicans hold that view. The authors continue that while public confidence in key institutions, including Congress, the media, and the Supreme Court, has declined across the board in recent years, the size of the opinion divide over schools is unique, and it's uniquely dangerous. The neoliberal consensus that characterized education policy for the previous several decades, problematic as it was, with its focus on standardized testing, has been replaced by fierce partisanship. Americans are now more likely to support or oppose particular education policies based on their political affiliations. This deepening political divide has profound implications for the nation's schools. Historian Johan Neem reminds us, "Our system of taxpayer-funded public schools is dependent upon the support of the entire public, not just the members of one party. If public education is going to exist and be truly public, then all Americans need to be able to see themselves and their interests represented there." The next subheading, "What are schools for?" continues. For the previous 3 decades, the mantra on both the left and the right was college and career readiness. Political leaders and policymakers were also remarkably united on how to measure the success of American schools in achieving this goal: standardized tests in math and reading. Now, however, at a time of skyrocketing higher education costs and amid concerns among Republicans that colleges are the sites of woke indoctrination, the public is beginning to turn against this vision. And support for standardized testing has plummeted. The public has cooled on the central premise of the high-stakes accountability era, rejecting the idea that test scores are the best way to judge the performance of schools, teachers, and students. Yet, even as bipartisan coalition has collapsed, no coherent vision of why we have schools and what we want them to do has emerged to take its place. Should schools be focused on raising young patriots or instilling religious values, as a loud chorus on the right now demands? Should they be helping students identify challenges in the world, then arming them with the tools that they'll need to address them, as proponents of so-called action civics believe? Or is that approach actually Marxism in disguise, as conservative critics allege? Should schools be narrowly focused on the basics, reading, writing, and math? Or should they provide students with a far more expansive education? And what about social and emotional skills like self-awareness, self-control, and getting along with others? The roiling debate over what we want public education to do is made even more explosive by the contradictory roles that schools play in this country. On the one hand, schools are where the well-to-do go to launder their privilege. We view schools as the key mechanism for meritocratic sorting, and we accept that those with the highest status, educational credentials deserve the social and economical goodies that they end up with. As a consequence, parents are constantly angling for an advantage. On the other hand, schools are a massive social welfare program. We all contribute different amounts of tax dollars to the enterprise, and then we spread those dollars in a relatively equal fashion across all young people, even those who aren't citizens. The upshot is that we're doing two contradictory things at the same time. We're competing against each other in an unfair game, and we're working together to even the playing field. No wonder we're constantly fighting, the authors say. Anytime we don't strike a perfect balance, we're ready to fight. On page 52, under subheading The War on Merit, I'm going to read this. For many well-to-do parents, efforts to address persistent racial and socioeconomic disparities in academic achievement represent a threat to their own children's chances. They are on high alert for any sign that their kids are being handicapped, particularly in the schools. Education, after all, is how young people are supposed to get ahead in a society in which social and economic status are presumably earned by virtue of talent and hard work. This meritocratic myth has turned our schools into high-stakes sorting grounds. Okay, and then on page 53, in 1961, Max Rafferty, a conservative California educator, delivered a speech that went viral by pre-internet standards. In The Passing of the Patriot, he took aim at the public schools for no longer teaching patriotism, and instead turning teens into booted, sideburned, duck-tailed, unwashed, leather-jacketed slobs. The speech, which was reprinted by Reader's Digest, launched Rafferty's political career, propelling him to 8 controversial years as California's top education official. During that time, he revoked the credentials of 1,000 teachers for being morally unfit, supported what he termed a little bit of censorship in school libraries, and attacked the use of busing to achieve school integration. Nearly 6 decades later, Donald Trump channeled the spirit of Max Rafferty in his own broadsides against the schools. Announcing the creation of a commission to further the cause of patriotic education, Trump denounced what he described as a twisted web of lies being taught about systemic racism in America. Patriotic moms and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country, Trump declared. The authors foreshadow that as they continue to argue through the book, the concern that public schools and K-12 teachers are radicalizing youngsters has been persistent across the decades. But the outsized role played by young voters in the 2020 midterm elections, essentially blocking GOP gains, has resulted in calls to raise the voting age and has intensified scrutiny on the schools and what they teach. Okay, I'm going to read this all because it's hard to paraphrase, and this is important. After the 2022 midterm elections, Larry Arnn, the influential president of Hillsdale College, warned that urgent measures were called for, noting that 6 of 10 voters under 30 had supported candidates who were committed to less liberty and more expansive bureaucracy. Arnn pointed to public schools as the culprit. To me, this indicates that we are failing to provide kids a proper education, or that others are succeeding in giving them a bad one. He wrote, Hillsdale itself is playing an instrumental role in the effort to re-educate youngsters. Its 1776 curriculum, premised on the idea that America is an exceptionally good country, has been widely embraced by Republican officials across the country, while its network of Hillsdale classical education charter schools is expanding rapidly. They think that you want to indoctrinate their kids, so they've hatched a plan to indoctrinate yours, is how Colorado investigative reporter Logan Davis describes this mindset. In the reporting, Davis has tried to make sense of the school culture wars in Colorado, where voters narrowly elected a conservative slate of school board members in 2021. This was in Woodland Park. So again, they were just elected in 2021 in a small rural town. And he says, the consequences for the district's 1,800 students have been profound. The new leadership moved swiftly to remake the school district, including opening a controversial classical charter school that pledges to free students from indoctrination by the left by looking to antiquity for inspiration. Then, in January of 2023, Woodland Park adopted the American Birthright Social Studies Standards, one of a growing body of alternative curricular approaches that emphasizes patriotism and Christianity, and opposes the teaching of current events, civic engagement, and project-based learning. Over the loud opposition of many parents and teachers, as well as the Colorado Board of Education, which had previously rejected the standards for being ideologically extreme, Woodland Park became the first school district in the country to take up American Birthright. That story continues on page 56, and it says, this battle over how to teach social studies in a small school district in Colorado isn't a random one-off. Instead, it's the canary in the coal mine. Conservatives have long expressed fear that if we overemphasize what's negative about American history, students will cease to believe in the country. And yet what's happening in Woodland Park also represents a new, more explicitly partisan thrust to the history wars. As Davis concluded, it's about turning out the kids to vote for Republicans in 2036 and using taxpayer dollars to do it. That is horrifying. On page 57, it says, in an April 2023 interview with the New York Times, the head of the American Principles Project, a social conservative advocacy group, made a startling admission. In its effort to find an issue that would galvanize social conservatives, the group had landed on the restriction of transgender rights, particularly among young people, almost by accident. Now, we're quoting. Here's a quote. "We knew we needed to find an issue that the candidates were comfortable talking about," said Terry Schilling, "and we threw everything at the wall." Prior to 2020, no states prohibited trans youth from participating in school sports. Today, such laws are on the books in roughly half of the states. A movement that began with a concern about athletic fairness now encompasses a broad range of restrictions on trans youth healthcare and rights. The bitter battle over transgender rights in schools reflects a deep partisan divide, as well as age-old questions over who gets to make the decisions when it comes to young people, and none of this is going away anytime soon. Page 59 says, Joe Biden has called transgender discrimination the civil rights issue of our time and has made the expansion of Title IX, the 1972 civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination in any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, a policy priority. Page 60, fanning the flames. In Florida, for example, after Ron DeSantis signed the controversial Parents' Right in Education, quote, "Don't Say Gay" bill into law, state education officials directed school districts and charter school governing boards to disregard federal guidance on sexual discrimination and gender identity. Meanwhile, a growing number of states are threatening to reject federal education funds altogether, the bulk of which go to support schools serving students in poverty in order to avoid compliance with civil rights regulations. Bottom of that page, it explains that the Heritage Foundation has been fanning the flames of the school culture wars since its founding a half-century ago, when a bitter conflict over textbooks erupted in Kanawha County, West Virginia in the 1970s. Heritage seized on the dispute. One of the publications argued that the public schools were teaching students to embrace racism, fascism, or any other ism, including cannibalism. Conservative parents must stop trusting public education, one Heritage Foundation writer implored in 1978, urging them to attack and disrupt their local school boards in any way they could. The historical parallels are anything but accidental. Then, as now, Heritage saw the school culture wars as key to undermining faith in public schools, part of the larger project of advancing private school vouchers. While the specific issues may have changed, the group's goal of ending public education entirely remains the same. They're fanning the flames of conflict, and they're working to advance school privatization policies in state after state. And this chapter ends with this quote. Conservatives have never had an opportunity like this on the education issue before, proclaimed Heritage President Kevin Roberts in 2022. We have to seize it. Chapter 4, what's religion got to do with it? Page 62. It's really getting good now. Okay, here are some happenings in 2023. In Oklahoma, the first religious charter school in America opened. It's a virtual Catholic charter, and it's paid for with public funds. Religion is embedded into the curriculum and run as a genuine instrument of the church. In Texas, a bill was passed that allows unlicensed religious chaplains to work in mental health roles in public schools. And in Florida, a Christian school that receives over $1.6 million each year sent a letter notifying parents that any LGBTQ students would need to leave immediately. The next page, on page 63, covers what is Christian nationalism. The stories that I just told you raise an obvious question: whatever happened to the separation of church and state? And the answer to that is that under the umbrella of Christian nationalism, many religious conservatives are aggressively pushing their faith into and onto our public schools. Definition: Christian nationalism is the belief that the United States was founded as an explicitly Christian country and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Christian nationalists believe that America is a Christian nation and being Christian is part of being truly American. They believe that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, that a retreat from Christian values threatens the survival of the country, and that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Page 64. The headline, Keep 'em Separated. And now we're going to revisit a high school civics lesson. The First Amendment prohibits the establishment of an official religion in the U.S. The framers of the Constitution saw the right to a secular government, one that doesn't impose or compel support for a particular religion, as a fundamental right. 100 years-ish later, in the 1870s, a clause to the First Amendment was proposed by James G. Blaine, congressman from Maine. That rhymes. Why haven't we made this a limerick? What else rhymes with Blaine and Maine? Congressman from Maine, James G. Blaine. Plain, drain. Ooh, oh. Blaine's amendment was in a response to a wave of people immigrating from Catholic countries, mostly Italy and Ireland, where public schools were full of religion and the King James Bible was part of the curriculum. Since America's public schools did not include religion, Catholics started their own private schools, many of which still exist. Blaine had the foresight to predict that supporters of Catholic schools would want public funds to support them, so he wrote the amendment to include no money raised by taxation in any state for the support of public schools or derived from any public fund nor any public lands shall ever be under the control of any religious sect. Continuing on page 64, Blaine's proposed amendment passed in the House but not in the Senate. State legislators then began drafting baby Blaines that were adopted in most state constitutions, which effectively established a separation of church and state in public education. Page 65, the subheading Weaponizing Religious Freedom. This section mentions that creative workarounds to the separation of church and state have been successful in funneling public school dollars to religious schools, like tax credit scholarships and education savings accounts. A very conservative Supreme Court today embraces the extreme definition of religious freedom and has ruled in favor of funding schools with tax dollars. In one instance, they cited that because the state already uses public funds to pay for charter schools, that denying a religious school access to that money is a violation of the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. The Education Wars authors warn that it's only a matter of time before the baby Blaines in state constitutions are struck down. James Blaine, congressman from Maine. While others, public funds they wanted to drain, we can't do that, Blaine explained. Not there yet. Page 69, subheading When Dinosaurs Walked with Humans. Historian Adam Latz argues that the Supreme Court is ushering in a brave new world of publicly funded religious schools in which tax money is used to teach kids that dinosaurs walked with humans, that girls primarily come into the world to grow up and bear children, and that only heterosexuals deserve rights. Page 70 explains that roughly 5,000 sectarian schools are funded with public money. Of those schools, 30% use curriculum provided by Abeka, Bob Jones's University, or Accelerated Christian Education. The most popular of those three, Abeka, teaches that in the late 1800s, Satan hatched the ideas of evolution, socialism, communism, progressive education, and modern psychology to undermine American religiosity. It teaches students things like radical environmentalists view mankind as the enemy of nature, and that Nelson Mandela was a Marxist agitator who pushed his country toward communist tyranny and radical affirmative action. Page 71 continues that Abeka is popular with religious schools and homeschooling parents, but high school courses that include their materials are not recognized by many colleges and universities, including the entire University of California system. History professor Kathleen Wellman is quoted saying that parents should be aware that although children might be coming home with an ordinary textbook, the messages inside are not what people would ordinarily learn. It's estimated that 2 million students each year are using these conservative Christian textbooks in their private schools and homeschooling, and that number is likely to grow dramatically as states have no choice but to fund religious education. Now let's continue to page 74 under the subheading, What's the Big Deal? Well, the authors explain that we fund public education with our tax dollars for a reason. Roughly 45% of the average American school's funding comes from local sources, roughly 45% from the state, and 10% from the federal budget. Numbers vary from place to place, but the general rule is that all three levels of government, local, state, and federal, contribute to the cost of public education. The rationale for this is as simple as it is overlooked. Taxpayers benefit from public education, whether or not they have children in the schools. We have a stronger economy, a better society, and a healthier democracy as a result of our free and universal approach to K-12 education. When it comes to using public funds for religious instruction, the question to ask isn't, is this the preference of some families? It's, is there broad public benefit in using taxpayer dollars for that purpose? Page 75 includes a New York Times investigation that revealed private schools in New York offer little English and math and almost no science or history, instead drilling students in Jewish law, prayer, and religion. Other states, including Arizona, Iowa, and Florida, have essentially barred the public from reviewing the content of what students are and aren't learning in voucher schools. Now here's a little story time from me. I can personally attest to this being true. I attended Christian private school for 2.5 years, 5th grade, 6th grade, and the beginning of 7th. When I went back to public school, social studies was very confusing. I was like, who are all these people? What do you mean other countries? I knew the names of American presidents and that Columbus discovered America in 1492 and that like a super long time ago, there was slavery, but now there's not slavery anymore because Abraham Lincoln. But what that school lacked in history curriculum, it made up for with Bible curriculum. Every week, my 7 classmates and I would receive a printout of a long Bible passage. It was 5 to 10 verses, and every Friday, the teacher called us up to her desk one by one to recite the passage word for word. It was the King James Version, which included words like "dosseth," and every single mistake was a point marked off. We'd get our grade, we'd get handed the next Bible verse, and then encouraged to spend our time over the weekend memorizing it all. This was the core of our studies. It was like the most important thing to work on at home. We kept the paper with the verse in our pocket at all times, on our person, and other adults throughout the week would just like stop us, like the lunch lady and the janitor would just, hey you, pop quiz, what's your Bible verse? And we'd have to stop whatever we were doing, hand them the verse so that they could read it and try to recall all, 750 to 1,000 words on demand and then wait for their judgment. Oh, and also the first thing every single day, we would recite Pledge of Allegiance and then the pledge to the Christian flag and then the pledge to the Bible and then the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish and then the pledge to the Christian flag in Spanish and then the pledge to the Bible in Spanish. Why? I don't know, but it is still ingrained in my brain. I'm going to try the Bible one and I'm going to mess it up. And I know I have Spanish teachers that watch this and listen to this, so this could go really bad really quick, but I'm going to go for it, okay. Juro fidelidad a la Biblia, la palabra sagrada de Dios, la ley, una lámpara en mis pies y una luz en mi camino, esconderé sus palabras en mi corazón, pero no pecar contra usted. I think I missed one line in there. I don't know. I don't even know what any of that means. I don't know Spanish. Another core class that was like 50 minutes a day, 5 days a week, was penmanship. And that was in 5th and 6th grade. We would get graded on the exact slant and letter height and loop size. And to this day, I do my lowercase r's as uppercase r's as an act of rebellion. Science was limited to rocks and animals. The extent of environment lessons was the water cycle. Definitely no sex ed or any useful health classes. One time when I was 12, I thought that I was pregnant and that my child would be Jesus because I didn't have a period for a few months and nobody told me that that was normal. I just thought that if you miss your period, you're pregnant because movies. Several years later, I received a lesson in sex ed when my boyfriend informed me that the pull-out method is a viable form of birth control, and I learned firsthand that that's not true when I became pregnant at 17. Then 15 years after that, my first month after getting elected to the school board, I publicly request for a sex ed committee to be formed and for an updated, medically accurate sex ed curriculum to be approved. And all of a sudden, there's an army of pearl-clutching blonde ladies coming at me for violating their parental rights and telling me that parents are experts at their own kids and that they only support teaching their kids and all other 320,000 kids in the school district that the best birth control is to obey Jesus and practice abstinence until marriage. Yeah, that works so freaking well. Yeah, no, you do not want to go there with me, okay? Okay, Aaron? No. Anyway, where were we? Page 75. Using taxpayer dollars to support religious schools or any other school that would advance a particular ideology that isn't broadly shared should raise serious questions for us. Our public schools are often segregated by race and income, given the deeper patterns of segregation in our communities. Still, the vast majority of American children are enrolled in their local public schools, which they attend together regardless of religious affiliation. Why would taxpayers support schools with the potential to fracture society even further? The answer is they likely won't. The more that publicly funded schools demand that gay students don't attend or teach girls that they're lesser than boys or tell non-believers that they're going straight to hell, the more the very idea of public education is eroded. Page 76 concludes this chapter with religious freedom is being used to justify school vouchers, religious charter schools, and an intensified effort to inject more religion into public schools. But as the separation of church and state is chipped away, the rights of students with a different religion, no religion at all, or whose very identities are judged to be an affront to Christianity, hang in the balance. Chapter 5, What's Really Behind the Push for Parental Rights. Page 77 opens with a story from Charleston, South Carolina, which will sound familiar to anyone who was paying attention to school board meetings during the heart of the pandemic. And Jean A.J. Davis co-founded Low Country Parents Association in 2020 as a way to help parents navigate distance learning and ensure that perspectives and voices of Black parents were heard by key decision makers. That's pretty standard activism. Davis was surprised at how quickly the definition of parent activism came to mean something else entirely. Furious parents began attending meetings, first outraged by COVID mitigation policies, then about any mention of race or sexuality in schools, then about social and emotional learning, and then claims of pornographic material in libraries. He observed that the parents were white and more affluent than the parents he represented, and they seemed to be remarkably well connected politically. Davis was even more alarmed when the former state superintendent chimed in, accusing schools of being captive to a liberal agenda. That's when he started to think, this is not standard activism, something is going on here. Conservative legislators embraced the cry for parental rights and quickly rolled out bills, one to censor classroom discussion, another to punish teachers and librarians who violated speech bans, and another to create a private school voucher program vast enough that it threatened the existence of public education in South Carolina. Davis then joined forces with a broad statewide coalition of pro-public education groups to oppose the so-called parents' rights bills and were successful in stopping them from becoming law. Davis's observations had been correct, and as he witnessed the pro-public coalition massively outnumber the group of angry parents' rights activists, he realized that the power of groups like Moms for Liberty doesn't come from numbers, but the fact that their cause has been picked up by people in power. He concluded that parents' rights is being used to advance an unpopular right-wing agenda. Page 79, we learn about the original Moms for Liberty, the OGs. Ever heard of the John Birch Society? Didn't think so. It was a far-right group founded in the 60s by Massachusetts candy maker John Welsh, in which members were referred to as Birchers. Motion to start calling Moms for Liberty folks Birchers. Do I have a second? The OG Moms for Liberty / Birchers claimed that far-reaching communist conspiracies represented an existential threat to the nation, capitalism, and Christianity. We'll talk about the Birchers more in a minute. I'm not going to stop saying Birchers. Way before there were Birchers, as early as the 1920s, there were groups defending parental rights like the National Association of Manufacturers. Now, they were upset with government overreach because of the recent ban on child labor. This group, remember they're manufacturers, was able to rile up parents with the narrative that this ban took away parents' authority of their offspring, and it was the government's way of reaching into the private sanctum of their home. Oh, and there were federal spies who were watching your farms, and they will crack down on you if you even have your kids like helping out around the house. Yeah, it's because the government just doesn't want your kids doing any household chores, and not because children were laboring in factories at great physical peril, like injury and often death. I'm not entirely sure why parents bought that one, but they did. Now back to the Bouchers. Page 80. Now remember, the communists were targeting America. Capitalism and Christianity in the schools were their main target. The Bouchers were urged to take over local PTA chapters and run for school board. They injected hot-button issues like demanding an end to sex ed, the removal of socialist textbooks and materials, and the return of prayer. In communities where they had the manpower, or Boucher power, they succeeded in hounding out teachers and school officials using aggression and intimidation. Even where Bouchers were sparse, they knew that a small group of loud, angry voices can still play an enormously disruptive role. Told you it sounds familiar. Today, the John Birch Society is forgotten, but its legacy of culture war, conspiratorial thinking, and chaos lives on in the current generation of far-right education activists. Page 81. What rights do parents have? This is all about getting clear on what a right is. Rights are absolute. They are held up regardless of desires of others. One person's exercise of her rights runs the risk of infringing on the rights of someone else. One key role of government, then, is ensuring that the powerful don't exercise their rights at the expense of the weak. Now, using the working definition, it seems clear that most of the rights parents might reasonably lay claim to regarding education have already been enshrined in law. Over the years and over the battles about expanding parents' rights, the Supreme Court has weighed the same, and they are always in favor of parental rights. For instance, the court finds that as long as parental interests did not interfere with the well-being of the child or the legitimate interest of society, those rights should be respected. The court asserted the power of the state to regulate and inspect schools, as well as to require children to attend school for the advancing of good citizenship and public welfare. But then the court again identified a limit to state power by including that the state could not seek to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. So basically, parents have the right to choose alternative options outside of the public school system, provided that the basic elements of public interest were being advanced. Children could be compelled to attend school, and education could be defined in a particular way, but they could not be kept from being instructed in the family's religious or philosophical beliefs. U.S. courts have consistently recognized the fundamental role of parents in directing the education of their children, but they have not made absolute declarations about what parents have the right to do regardless of circumstance. That's probably because another group of humans also have rights: the kids. Page 86 goes into what about kids' rights. Parental rights advocates present their struggle as one against an oppressive state seeking to undercut their authority, but they have little, if anything, to say about the rights of children, and that is intentional. Arguing against the theoretical interest of the state is easy, whereas parental love is easy to intuit, and the authority of parents seems natural. The very concept of state interests is nebulous at best, and it can sound downright nefarious. It continues. We all benefit from having an adequately educated citizenry. That's what is meant by compelling state interest. Elections, trial by jury, and other features of democracy depend on a reasonably educated citizenry. In other words, we pay for public schooling with our tax dollars because the stakes for society are too high to leave the matter of education to chance. Try to explain that to a Boucher, though, and they'll just respond, "We don't co-parent with the government." They have to push parents' rights so strongly because when the conversation around children's rights begins, then it's a losing battle for the Bouchers. Bouchers claim that schools are brainwashing kids, but the truth is that public schools are where young people become autonomous adults, meaning they encounter ideas that may contradict with what they've been learning at home. Page 87 continues that young people are far more progressive than their elders on a broad range of issues, including LGBTQ rights, rights, economic redistribution, guns violence, climate change, and access to health insurance. And they're rapidly becoming more politically engaged, limiting what they learn in school or requiring that they watch videos from PragerU, a conservative advocacy group in social studies class, is one way to try to shape the thinking of future generations in a more conservative direction, and strengthening the rights of certain parents over their children is another. Giving parents more say regarding what their kids can read or what pronouns they can use at school are also ways of tapping the brakes on generational change. Page 87 continues into other parents' rights. States that are enacting parental rights laws are driving teachers to leave the profession. Example, in 2023, Jenna Barbie quit teaching while she was put under investigation by the Florida Department of Education for violating the Parental Rights in Education Act, commonly known as Don't Say Gay. Her crime? Showing a Disney movie that featured an openly gay character. Some more context to this that isn't covered in the book is that this movie is called Strange World. It's an animated PG movie about science and ecosystems. It was newly released in 2022. The teacher played it after students finished a standardized test, and she had permission slips from all the parents to play a PG movie. And then she was put under investigation because a subplot line included a male character having a crush on a boy. In recent years, Florida and most red states have enacted laws like this that amplify the power of some parents while limiting the authority of others. These laws give individual parents the authority to object to specific books and require school districts to address those complaints, including restricting access for all the kids in that school or the entire school district. That means that the views of a small minority of parents carry an outsized weight affecting everyone. Now, are you ready for this? A Washington Post investigation found that of the 150-ish school districts where books were challenged between 2021 and 2022, the vast majority of those originated from just 11 people. 7 states have now adopted laws that threaten school librarians with jail time and huge fines for giving kids books deemed obscene or harmful, but those terms are left out. They're left undefined in the law. So what one person thinks is obscene, another person may not. So librarians now just have to wait to see if they're going to be investigated and punished for not doing their job of letting kids read and check out books. And that's why a lot of librarians and school administrators now are just ridding the shelves of any books that might upset any parents, including books like Charlotte's Web and Harry Potter. Harry Potter because there's magic, which is not Christian, and Charlotte's Web because talking animals is not natural, and that's not how God created animals. These new policies also let small groups of parents dictate how the children of other parents are referred to at school. In Virginia, a parent can legally object to the use of another student's preferred pronouns, citing their First Amendment and religious freedom rights. And that holds up per the conservative governor's policies. So that parent gets religious freedom rights directly related to a student who has nothing to do with them except existing in a classroom with their child, and the student who isn't bothering or harming anyone at all gets no rights in this situation, and neither do their parents. That's how that works, in case you're wondering. Page 89 continues. A growing number of states, meaning state legislators and even state boards of education, allow and even encourage parents to sue schools, districts, and individual teachers over policies and materials that they object to. In New Hampshire, a controversial law that bans the teaching of divisive concepts allows anyone claiming to be aggrieved by a suspected violation to file a lawsuit against the school or the school district. In both Tennessee and Florida, school officials can be sued if a transgender person enters a bathroom or locker room that doesn't correspond with the sex on their official record. Aggrieved parents are being empowered to do this, and they're often rewarded financially for it. Legal scholar John Michaels refers to this as the grievance industrial complex, which now powers the right-wing media ecosystem. These are the same people, by the way, that throw around the phrase liberal snowflake. Motion to start calling book banners the aggrieved. Do I have a second? The lesson here is it doesn't take many parents to have an impact on policy, especially when their efforts are backed by deep-pocketed organizations. Page 89. When a reporter from Education Week looked into parent lawsuits against school districts over pronoun policies, she found that a tight network of conservative Christian groups was behind all of them. What appeared to be a parent-driven revolt over a contentious social issue turned out to be a highly coordinated national effort to restrict the rights of LGBTQ students. Page 90 mentions dark money. Dark money is a term for huge amounts of money in politics in which the original source of money is hidden. The money is deployed to fund front groups around the country that attack democratic institutions, especially public education. Scholar Maurice Cunningham, an expert in tracking dark money, found the dark money pattern when he studied the evolution of the Birchers, aka Moms for Liberty, and Parents Defending Education. Behind positive-sounding names and kitchen table origin stories, he found well-funded operations tightly linked to right-wing networks and conservative donors. What he didn't find was any messaging about the real education policy that these groups' founders have been unsuccessfully pushing for decades. Cunningham is quoted saying, "Studies show that the public overwhelmingly disagrees with the education choices favored by the wealthy. If the real powers behind the curtain are known, the public will ask questions that school privatization advocates don't want to answer." Chapter 6. What's so bad about funding students, not systems? Page 94 opens with the state of Iowa and that in 2023, Governor Kim Reynolds was successful in passing private school choice legislation. The new law would allow any family to use taxpayer funds to pay for tuition at any of Iowa's private schools, almost all of which were religious. Attempts at vouchers had failed in Iowa for years, but one thing was different. A new catchy slogan, "Fund students, not systems," had emerged after the pandemic, and it was catching on. Within a couple years, legislators in 42 states proposed bills to enact or expand voucher programs, and 14 of them passed, all successful at using the same rhetoric: fund students, not systems. So send public money to the student, not keeping it in the system. Is it just me, or is this lady giving Dolores umbrage? Page 94. Separate but unequal. While the slogan may be fresh, school vouchers have been a priority among conservatives since libertarian economist Milton Friedman first proposed the idea in 1955. Rather than funding local schools and allowing children to attend for free, Friedman argued that the state should send funds directly to families in the form of a voucher, encouraging them to enroll their children at the schools of their choosing, public or private. Competition from the private sector would erode public schools, which they mockingly labeled as government schools. Heard that before. Friedman's school voucher proposal appeared a year after the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools. Convenient. For conservative elites in southern states, the timing of vouchers was perfect, and as public school enrollment rose, so did their efforts to dismantle the system of free public schools. In Texas, a bill was passed that gave a tuition grant for private school to any family that pulled their children out of an integrated school. Now, school choice advocates aren't eager to claim that history, but it is important to remember that vouchers and tuition grants were born from the resistance to constitutional guarantees of equal treatment and equal opportunity for all students. Page 97. An old crusade. So far we've learned that vouchers, which over time have been rebranded to all sorts of things like tax credit scholarships, education savings accounts, and funding students, not systems, have long been part of a larger effort by religious conservatives to aggressively push their faith onto students. Page 98 goes into that vouchers are also supported by folks who don't have a religious ideology, but one of free markets, the privatization of all services, including education. But with most private schools being religious and that pesky separation of church and state in the Constitution, free market ideologists had to get creative, and over the years, they came up with a lot of financial workarounds. In some states, corporations can receive dollar-for-dollar tax credits for any donations that they make to private school scholarship funds. They get reimbursed by taxpayers because that fund is set up as a not-for-profit scholarship granting organization. Nearly all of the donations/scholarships ends up paying for tuition of private school students, but because the taxpayer money gets reimbursed to the donor and not the religious school, it circumvents the process. This section ends with the quote, "There's nothing new about this at all," says Pastor Charles F. Johnson, the founder of Pastors for Texas Children, part of a growing chorus of religious groups that opposes school vouchers. "The genius of America is a church-state separation. The people who framed our American experiment understood that it's toxic when the government gets into the religion business." So there are a lot of religious people, religious leaders opposed to school vouchers, FYI. 99 continues with a subheading, "Why on earth would we fund systems?" And when you hear the word system, you think bureaucracy, distant, faceless, resistant to change. And when you hear student, you think of a child, probably one that you know and care about. Betsy DeVos, whom if Kim Reynolds is Umbridge, then DeVos is Voldemort, told Fox News, "I like to envision kids with their backpacks going off to wherever their education is, and they carry those resources, that money that is invested in them, in the backpack for whatever works for them." She's full of crap, by the way. Betsy DeVos is envisioning checks being cut to the for-profit schools that her family owns, one student at a time. If you followed the Storytime episodes so far, then you remember that I watched a documentary called Backpack Full of Cash, and I realized that the superintendent that had been put on a pedestal during the school board executive training at Harvard had been featured in that documentary. And this is why that documentary is called that. The marketing works. The rhetoric that you can send your kid with a backpack full of money out to have the best education available is a pretty picture. And that's why fund students, not systems, hits so hard with parents. The truth is, though, that when you fund the public school system, you fund the student, that child that you care about. It's just that they've found a phrase that evokes emotional responses by pitting the word system and student against each other when it never has been either or and never was intended to be. Page 100 explains that for decades, voucher supporters were very straightforward about their ideals and their agenda. They argued that markets were better than democratic politics, that local schools should be forced to compete just like businesses, and families should operate like customers. But it turns out that most Americans on both sides of the political fence like the democratic nature of public education. They even see it as a cornerstone of our society. But decade after decade, vouchers were rejected every time that they were pitched as policy. Over the years, that message was modified. Instead of talking about markets, they talk about parental rights, while speaking ominously about indoctrination. Pro-voucher groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, Betsy DeVos's American Federation for Children, the Friedman Foundation, which is now called EdChoice, the Cato Institute, and more, continue to make an enemy out of systems. For instance, systems are unresponsive to children and their families. Page 100, subheading is bad data. On top of making boogeymen out of anything that they can, voucher advocates fall back on the claim that private schools are better than public schools, even though evidence says otherwise. Learning growth in public schools on average is higher than in private schools. All right, this is crazy. Okay, page 101, I'm reading directly, that the best research shows that vouchers actually harm the kids who use them. Scholar Josh Cowan has spent much of his career studying the impact of vouchers, and the results he saw led him to become an outspoken critic. Although a few tiny studies from the late 1990s and early 2000s showed small gains in test scores for voucher users, Cowan says, since 2013 the record is dismal. The bigger the program, the worse kids have done. He says, noting that independent studies in Indiana, Louisiana, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. have shown impacts on test scores on par with the results following catastrophes like the COVID-19 pandemic and Hurricane Katrina. If evidence meant anything to education policy, vouchers would have disappeared years ago, but they persisted. What explains the poor results of voucher programs? While Americans tend to associate private schools with elite, walled institutions, a more accurate stand-in is a low-budget religious school located in a strip mall or a church basement. The bigger that voucher programs get, the more kids end up in these kind of schools. Compared with elite private schools with large endowments and strong academic records, few of which ever agree to accept vouchers, the schools that choose to participate in voucher programs tend to be financially distressed, often taking state money as a taxpayer bailout. Page 102 covers the problem of scale. The scenario that voucher supporters want has families coming and going and shopping for education like they do anything else in the free market. But schools aren't coffee shops. Starbucks can just brew more or less coffee each day as needed, but schools face a more complicated set of calculations. All right, and now I'm going to read this directly from page 103. Going forward because it's really good. Take the typical public school, where class size ranges from 20 to 25 students. In a building with 400 students, that means roughly 18 classrooms operating simultaneously, requiring at least 18 professional educators to lead classes of approximately 22 students. That. But when new students enroll or existing students leave, they don't come and go in class-sized groups of 22. If an elementary school were to lose 35 students from one year to the next, for instance, it might lose an average of 6 students from each grade level. According to the logic of voucher advocates, the school's budget would shrink by $500,000 when those students took their funding allocations to their new schools. But each grade level would shrink only slightly, from 66 students to 60. The most logical move would be to have 3 classes of 20 instead of 3 classes of 22, meaning the school still needs the same number of teachers. Moreover, the cost of running buses, keeping the facility clean, heating or cooling the school, and operating the cafeteria all remain fixed. A school that needs to cut $500,000 from its budget really has only one place to turn: staffing. Teachers would lose their jobs, class sizes would increase, and the overall culture of the school would be significantly harmed. For many voucher proponents, such an outcome would be a feature rather than a bug, because roughly 80% of school expenditures are on personnel costs. Those seeking to limit education spending have long made the case for a shift away from having a trained and licensed teacher in every classroom. No wonder that the same states enacting sweeping private school voucher programs are also loosening the requirements that regulate who can teach. For-profit micro schools, which are rapidly spreading across the country, require no teachers at all. Instead, they rely on low-paid guides who have passed a minimal background check. Next subheading, a fatal blow. At a forum in Cleveland in 2022, Voldemort, Betsy DeVos, laid out her vision for the future of education in vivid detail. Imagining a young man who lives on a large family farm in the rural Dakotas, DeVos described him spending mornings in the bean fields while listening to a book. He takes his literature courses that way, she observed. He then would head off to an apprenticeship at the John Deere plant. In the afternoon, her rural student would make his way to a charter school where he learned core subjects with other students. Missing from this fantasy was any mention of the local public school, or of a particularly inconvenient fact that rural communities are too sparsely populated to accommodate DeVos's vision of school choice. Even more problematically, for voucher supporters like DeVos, in places like rural North and South Dakota, school districts are typically the largest employers and serve as vital cultural anchors, often representing the last remaining piece of public infrastructure. In other words, the system is the community. Dismantle the schools and the community withers and dies. For small schools in rural communities, even small declines in enrollment can be fatal. An elementary school with only 1 class per grade, for instance, can only scale down so much before it becomes a one-room schoolhouse. Schools in places with higher population density are also at risk, as such communities are where new schools, those seeking to tap into voucher money, would be most likely to open. Long known for schools that are too large, urban areas could begin facing the opposite problem, an abundance of very small schools hanging by a financial thread. Once more, voucher advocates see such an outcome as a benefit rather than a cost. As acolytes of the free market believe schools should go out of business in a functional system, it's a sign that customers are exercising their influence over service providers and that competition in the market is strong. Students and families whose schools close, of course, may feel differently. Okay, so sidebar story time. So this is literally happening right now in the Clark County School District. Lundy Elementary, a rural school in Mount Charleston, took damage from a storm in 2023 and temporarily closed, displacing a dozen kids to the nearest school in Indian Springs over an hour away. The school district, CCSD, proposed to close the school permanently without repairing it, but parents rallied, and over the last few months, there's been several meetings, each hours long, about it. Public records then revealed that CCSD had been wanting to close Lundy down for a while, and the storm just provided the opportunity. During school board meetings, Trustee Linda Cavazos motioned to repair the school, and that vote failed. Then Trustee Garcia Morales motioned to close the school, and then that vote failed. So now they can do neither of those things, and CCSD is looking at building an extension to the local library, which the community is not okay with because their little rural school offered much more than just education for a few students. It was a hub of services and a staple of their community. So that is the current drama, some of it in CCSD. Page 105, subheading, Don't we already fund students, not systems, in higher education? Voucher advocates make the case that each year the federal government sends billions of taxpayer dollars to students, not systems, for college. So if it works for higher ed, then why wouldn't it work for K-12 schooling? The answer? It doesn't. The burden of paying for college rests upon the consumer. And while Pell Grants, federal loans, and discounted tuition all help, the free market style approach leaves students and their families with a tab. Colleges and universities set their own prices, and then they offer various packages of financial aid, but does not cover the full tuition, and the remainder is still more than many students and families can afford. Currently, college graduates carry nearly $2 trillion in student debt. Page 106 explains that this is the same model that voucher supporters are peddling for pre-K through high school students. For parents to take a voucher to the institution of their choice, they would be left with the remaining cost that the voucher does not cover. The competition between schools to enroll students and get that voucher money also means that schools have stronger incentives to recruit new customers than they do to educate them. Turning students into customers doesn't force schools to compete on the quality of education. Instead, they end up selling themselves in whatever way it takes to reach full enrollment. For some schools, that means manipulating rankings in outlets like U.S. News and World Report. That sounds pretty specific. Others rely on deceptive marketing to attract potential customers, students. Hey, little boy, come here. You want up here? Oh, look at my little skunk and your little fluffy tail. I love it. You stay here. Page 107. You listen, you read? Oh, you little Page 107. You little... Page 107, our experience with higher education funding should teach us that funding students, not systems, is a risky business. Scholar Nicholas Hillman is quoted saying, "Our higher education system isn't a model, it's a cautionary tale. Too many policymakers simply double down on the flawed logic that market forces will improve the educational experience. They won't. We need policymakers to promote policies that invest directly in colleges so they can deliver high-quality education at low cost to students." All right, page 107 starts with, if vouchers are so great, why aren't they more popular? Good question. Let's find out. All right, I'm going to read this directly through because it's really good too. Okay. In 2021, the Club for Growth, a conservative free market group, kicked off its National School Choice campaign with a chastening message for its supporters. Extensive polling had found that the school choice brand was irreparably damaged. It was viewed negatively by an overwhelming majority of registered voters who saw choice as nothing more than school vouchers. Advancing the vision, concluded the pollsters, would require a rebrand. They recommended education freedom as a new catchphrase. Although advocacy groups, including the DeVos-funded group American Federation for Children, routinely release surveys claiming to show overwhelming support for school choice, Americans have almost always rejected private school vouchers when they've been placed on the ballot. In Arizona, voters rejected a universal voucher program by a 2-to-1 margin, only to see their legislators enact an even more sweeping version of the program. And while political leaders have characterized new voucher laws as a response to public demand, polls show no such thing. Iowans, is that how you say people in Iowans? Iowans? It's getting late. Iowa humans. For example, they are broadly opposed to their state's new education savings account program, which allows the use of tax dollars to pay for private religious schools, homeschooling costs, and an array of other education expenses. Little boy, get. He's naughty. Come here. Stay here with me. It's okay. Okay. Democrats and Republicans, men and women, urban and rural dwellers, and parents of all backgrounds express disapproval of the program. So why aren't vouchers more popular? Why not? One reason, as noted earlier in this chapter, is that many Americans intuitively understand the relationship between public education and a functional democracy. Schools are often the most inclusive and democratic institutions in our communities, open to all, governed by locally elected officials, and responsive to local concerns. As such, they are seedbeds of democratic life at a time when most of our public activity is structured by the free market. Yet, there are also some very pragmatic reasons why vouchers tend to be unpopular. First of all, they tend to be budget busters. States that have enacted universal voucher programs are being saddled with costs that massively exceed projections. That's because publicly funding the cost of education for students who never attended public schools is expensive. Arizona's program, for instance, is on track to cost taxpayers an estimated $1 billion per year, a whopping 1,400% higher than what voucher proponents initially predicted. In Florida, the figure could reach as much as $4 billion each year. A second problem for voucher proponents is the fact that the vast majority of students who use vouchers never attended public schools. Between 70 and 90% of voucher users in states like Arizona, Missouri, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin were already attending private schools. A similar pattern can be found in states where once targeted voucher programs are being expanded. In Indiana and Ohio, voucher users are increasingly likely to be white, wealthy, and already enrolled in a private school. As a result, these programs merely drain funding from the public schools attended by the vast majority of students while offering financial windfalls to private school families. They're essentially coupons for the rich. Vouchers also subsidize taxpayer-funded discrimination. Let's just stop calling it a choice program and let's call it a private discriminatory education program funded with your tax dollars, civil rights attorney and disability education advocate Jeffrey Spritzer-Resnick told the investigative news outlet Wisconsin Watch. Reporters found dozens of schools in Wisconsin that appeared to discriminate against LGBTQ students or young people with disabilities, often citing religious principles or a lack of capacity to accommodate certain conditions. These same schools relied on public tax dollars for their funding. Investigative journalists in Florida and Arizona have similarly uncovered the ways that voucher schools circumvent anti-discrimination policies. Yet another problem for vouchers is that they tend to have weak transparency and oversight protections by design. There are few provisions to track where taxpayer funds are going or to guard against schools that discriminate, engage in criminal behavior, or fail the kids they serve. Education savings account programs have even less oversight, creating an education ATM that allows parents to spend funds on items including trampoline parks, Disney Plus subscriptions, and SeaWorld tickets. It's so wild that all these conservatives complain about people using food stamps and the things they're buying. Wait until they see the things that they buy with their education savings accounts. I imagine parents will get creative. Finally, voucher programs are a disaster for equity. The earliest voucher programs in Milwaukee and Cleveland were narrowly targeted at low-income families, most of whom were families of color. No longer. Today's programs are so-called universal vouchers, available to all families no matter how wealthy they are. For states with expansive and expensive private school choice programs, it is only a matter of time before the budgetary reality of supporting a parallel education education system hits home. The results will be massive cuts to the public schools attended by students who need and deserve the most support. Under this subheading, but we can still choose public schools, can't we? And on page 112, in Utah, a prominent school choice lobbyist named Allison Sorensen, the executive director of Education Opportunity for Every Child, was caught on tape saying that her goal was to destroy public education. She later regretted saying it, but Utahns knew that she was just saying the quiet part out loud. Rather than framing public education as a public good, vouchers reposition it as a form of welfare that's only given to those with children. In a voucher-based system, support for education will quickly begin to wither, first for high-income earners and eventually for anyone living above the poverty line. Soon we'll be left where we were prior to the common school movement in the 19th century. Wealthy families will send their kids to private schools or hire tutors, while poor families and students without parents will be left with the 21st century equivalent of a pauper school, a Chromebook, and an online curriculum. Voucher advocates talk endlessly about giving families options, but options are not a substitute for rights. Of greatest concern are students whose basic rights to an education requires schools to spend more on services. What happens when there are only a few students with disabilities in a locality and none of the options available to them meets their basic needs? What happens when the closest school offering support for English learners is 50 miles away? Proponents of funding students, not systems, have no answer to these questions. This chapter ends on page 113 with, sometimes what each of us wants as individuals can undermine what would be good for us collectively. We could get what we've asked for, but not what we need. Chapter 7, page 114, democracy is not a spectator sport. The story of white parents hounding a rural Georgia district's first diversity, equity, and inclusion official out of town made national headlines. As a ProPublica report would document, the parents pointed to the hiring of Cecilia Lewis, a former middle school principal, as proof that critical race theory, CRT, was taking over the schools in their district. The ensuing outrage would lead Lewis to quit the job that she had yet to start, providing shameful proof of the potency of the school culture wars. What happened next got far less attention. When those same parents ran for school board in 2022, united as a self-proclaimed family values slate and backed by the national 1776 Project PAC, they failed to pick up a single seat. It was likely their embrace of school privatization that did the candidates in. Arguments in favor of vouchers landed with a thud in a rural county where the closest private schools are 60 miles away. Anti-public school messaging, including arguments that local businesses shouldn't have to pay taxes to support the local schools, fared no better. These are wildly unpopular positions, says Alex Ames, the founder of Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. Voters who may have been supportive of the initial effort to take back the schools revolted at the idea of defunding them. You start to hear people say things like, wait a second, my daughter has a disability and she goes to that school. Opposition really started to steamroll once people understood that this was about taking something away from them. What happened in Georgia isn't unique. While groups like Moms for Liberty, Vouchers, have excelled at generating news coverages, culture war candidates have not fared particularly well at the ballot box. According to Ballotpedia, a site that tracks U.S. elections, in nearly 1,800 school board races across the country, conservative candidates who opposed discussions of race or gender in classrooms or opposed mask mandates during the pandemic lost 70% of their races. Even in states where lawmakers have aggressively pursued culture war agendas, including limiting discussions of race and gender in schools, candidates who have embraced the same themes often fall short when local voters have a choice. A similar dynamic played out in school board races in Ohio in 2022 and 2023. How then can we explain the fact that local voters are saying no to these candidates at a time when the State Board of Education and state lawmakers have relentlessly focused on culture war issues? Failures of culture war candidates also reflect the fact that the cause of parental rights is increasingly associated with policies that majorities of Americans reject, including censorship and book banning. It turns out that most people don't want someone else's parents or some outside group telling their kids what they can read or what ideas they can consider. When the advocacy group Moms Rising polled its members in 2023, it found that parents across the political spectrum shared a common set of concerns, including affordable childcare, safe schools, and gun safety as their top concerns. What the group's million-plus members didn't care about was the constellation of policy positions that co-founder Kristen Rowe-Finkbeiner characterizes as hate spaghetti. Hate spaghetti is book bans, the exclusion of LGBTQ students, and efforts to whitewash history. Well-funded groups are throwing issue after issue at the wall to see what sticks, she observed. But while hate is twice as sticky, Rowe-Finkbeiner is persuaded that such messages ultimately have no staying power. Moms are waking up and are beginning to understand that this is a political campaign aimed at tearing us apart. Page 117, Anger and Resolve. Laura Lee Abbey was shocked when she saw the signs. A candidate for school board in her Hudson Valley, New York community was trumpeting "Christ is King" on his placards, pledging to end the sexualization of children in the local schools. Abbey, who is married to her same-sex partner and has 2 young children, learned that he was just one of a group of candidates affiliated with the local chapter of Moms for Liberty. Vouchers. Anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans legislation is alarming, but groups like these are attacking our families on a much smaller scale right in our own neighborhoods, she wrote in a 2022 essay. Fear gave way to anger and then to resolve. Abbey joined with other concerned parents to mobilize against the candidates, making the case to local voters that teachers shouldn't be preachers, and urging them to vote in the upcoming election. All 3 of the candidates endorsed by Moms for Liberty ended up losing in a contest that saw double the usual voter turnout. But Abbey was just getting started. She and parent Karen Svoboda, I'm just tired, I'm saying these wrong, went on to found Defensive Democracy, which offers training and assistance to parents and other public school advocates seeking to start groups of their own. Are people in Clark County paying attention? Were we taking notes? Hundreds of groups are now pushing back against campaigns to ban books, inject religion into curriculum, and defund public schools. While these efforts are often grassroots and small scale, a number of organizations, groups including Defensive Democracy, Red, Wine, and Blue, and Heal Together are increasingly providing national coordination, sharing tips about how to effectively rally local communities around a vision of fully funded public schools that serve all kids. Yay. Karen Chenoweth spent her, this is page 118. Karen Chenoweth spent her career as an education journalist. By 2021, she was following with mounting concern the stories of extremist school board candidates and the deep-pocketed groups that were fanning the flames of school culture wars. The stakes are clear. They want to destroy public education, concluded Chenoweth. There's a whole playbook. Chenoweth started Democracy in Education with the aim of bringing together those seeking to protect public education. Today, she is one of a growing number of experts on what it takes to defeat extremists at the local level, as well as on why it remains so urgent to do just that. In places where such candidates have been victorious, says Chenoweth, they have done enormous damage and often in a short period of time. They harass and intimidate staff. They ban books. They charter religious schools. They do all kinds of things that most Americans don't want. But in communities that organize to rally the majority, extremists are almost always defeated. It takes work, organization, and dedication on the part of ordinary citizens, which is how democracy is supposed to work, notes Chenoweth. The old saying is, democracy is not a spectator sport, and the fight over school boards demonstrates exactly how true that is. By the way, in Clark County, Nevada right now, there are well-funded Moms for Liberty backed candidates in both the Clark County School Board elections, which is the 5th largest district in the country, as well as the Nevada State Board of Education, which is one of the seats that I'm currently running for. There are currently funded Moms for Liberty, Vouchers candidates in many, many elections here that are a huge risk to Nevada. We'll talk more about that in an upcoming episode, but 5-star alarm. Page 118, A Popular Vision. In 2023, the Popular Comms Institute in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, conducted a research study with more than 3,000 respondents across 5 battleground states. The goal to identify which messages would be most effective in defending public education and defeating authoritarian rhetoric. This is important for everyone to know. On 4 different issues, public education, critical race theory, book bans, and transgender student athletes, the group tested what they described as authoritarian messaging against rhetoric that was inclusive and pro-public education. It found that on every issue, a positive vision for making public education stronger and investing in kids outperformed well-informed authoritarian messages, regardless of factors like voter age, race, and education. And while such messaging was especially popular with Democrats, it also resonated with independents and Republicans. Popular comms concluded that, are you paying attention? The most effective strategy for defending public schools from extremist attacks was to tell a, quote, big us, small them story. Such messaging starts by telling a story of shared values about what kids in a given community deserve and invoking a multiracial us that is bigger than them. The strategy does include responding to divisive rhetoric, as well as calling out the deep-pocketed donors and ideologically aligned organizations that are often behind culture war flare-ups at the local level. But the power of big us, small them messaging comes from the breadth of the positive vision being put forward. Our positive vision for public education is popular and our opponents know it, says Popular Comms co-founder Allison Troy. That's why they keep manufacturing new ways to sow fear and hate in order to divide us against each other and distract us. For Troy, their study offered decisive evidence that people prefer a vision of abundance and possibility for kids, one that includes investment in public education. Our opponents know the only way that they can win is through division. We win by coming together around a clearly articulated vision of the future where every child in every community gets what they need to thrive at school. Page 121, Party-Free Zone. At a time of bitter partisan rancor, coalitions coming together in support of public education frequently transcend political divides. Despite all the rhetoric from the right regarding public schools as sites of political indoctrination, most Americans still see public education as a nonpartisan issue. That creates an opening for political candidates and coalitions of public school advocates to appeal to voters in ways that don't simply reflect party orthodoxies. Of course, avoiding partisanship can also be a challenge, especially when extreme candidates and organizations tout their political allegiances. Some have wondered if it might be politically savvy to make defending public education a priority of the Democratic Party. Yet, the danger in doing so is that the partisan framing of education issues risks alienating voters who are in what Zandra Rice Hawkins describes as the movable middle. They're hearing a lot of noise about book bans and bathroom policies from the right. Our challenge is to figure out how to talk about these issues and why they matter without politicizing them. In communities where extremist candidates and issue campaigns have been defeated, it's not because the left beat back the right, says Rice Hawkins. Rather, it's because a broad swathe of voters came together in support of shared values. The belief that all kids deserve access to high-quality education, for instance, or that a community cares about all of us, all of its kids. We end up outnumbering them every time. Finding common ground. Page 122. When Heather Dubois Bouranain, the executive director of the Wisconsin Public Education Network, speaks to school administrators, she comes bearing what sounds like surprising advice. Your angriest parent can be your greatest ally. The prospect of finding common ground with parents outraged over an ever-growing list of targets can seem daunting, even naive. But it's a challenge that Dubois Bouranain and her fellow public school advocates eagerly embrace. The people who are motivated to seek change are the people who are the most worked up, even if they're mad for the wrong reasons. They've already proven to you that they're willing to take their first step. In exchanges with parents who are worried about indoctrination, Dubois Bouranain doesn't respond with facts about what is and isn't happening in the local schools. Instead, she asks these parents what it would look like if their children were getting the best possible education. The answers are illuminating, she says. They want schools that are fully funded and staffed by adults who care about their kids and recognize them. There's the common ground. The next step in the conversation entails what Dubois Bouranain describes as connecting the dots, helping parents see the gap between what they want and what their school currently provides is a result of years of intentional underfunding by Wisconsin's GOP-controlled legislature. The strategy doesn't always work, she acknowledges. Sometimes the anger is too intense or the distance in value is too great to overcome, but the exercise is always worthwhile. Even if you can't find a shared value, understanding where they're coming from makes you better. All right, now this is a very important part. I want everyone to take notes on this, okay? According to the Popular Comms Institute, these messaging strategies are among the least effective for defending public education. So, Nevada Defenders of Public Education and other defenders of public education. This is what we want to avoid doing, although we've probably all done a lot of these. We want to avoid counter arguments that try to prove the other side wrong. For instance, saying critical race theory is a grad school level legal framework. It isn't taught in our schools. Chances are you've heard this claim made or even made it yourself. Yes, I have. Yet so-called counter-argument messaging is the least effective, in part because it often includes specialized terminology and jargon that can come across as condescending. The next one to avoid is condescending rhetoric that belittles other parents. Avoid rhetoric that characterizes other parents as ignorant or portrays them as lacking in agency. Also guilty in both of those. Okay. Next, avoid the over-reliance on facts and data. This approach can also play into the characterization of public school advocates as arrogant elitists. All right, I'm 3 for 0 right now. What about you? And the fourth and last one is presenting vulnerable students as victims. No matter how well-intentioned, portraying vulnerable students solely as victims is counterproductive. The solution: allow students to tell their own stories as part of a larger vision of what the community values. And to go back to that last page, to find common ground with all these people, I'm telling you, like during COVID and all the crazy meetings we'd have to sit through for hours and hours and hours, I always felt like this. I was like, okay, what are they really saying? Like, yes, they're screaming at me. Yes, they're screaming that Trustee Ford is anti-oxygen, and I can't respond back to them. All I can do is try to mouth to the audience, like, I'm not anti-oxygen, I promise. Yes, I have to sit there and listen to it. Yes, they're threatening to slash our tires, but all of these people care. And this is very interesting. And what's really driving this? And how do they all have the same exact talking points? Like, I was amazed by it the entire time for like that year-ish, listening to just hundreds of hours of screaming angry parents straight to my face. Good times, good times. Anyway, I am a little naive, but I do have hope that we can all come together, because I do feel like all the parents want the same things. They're being brainwashed to do their evil bidding. Okay, next. Page 124, and I think this one and this part's super, super important, okay? Defending public schools doesn't mean defending the status quo. While advocates see themselves as defending public schools, what they're not defending is the status quo. We recognize that public education is a public good, but we also recognize that our schools haven't been perfect for our families and that they need to be transformed, says Letha Muhammad, Executive Director of the Education Justice Alliance in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is part of a growing public education coalition known as Heal Together NC. Transforming the schools would mean ensuring that every child in the state gets the equal opportunities promised in the state's constitution, opportunities that have yet to be delivered upon. When we can come together across lines of difference and say, we want to defend and protect these schools, and we want to make them better for all of our families and all of our communities, we think we can turn the tide. Page 126, subheading, it takes more than one group of people. Even in strongly Republican Roanoke County, Virginia, the 2021 school board election represented a new extreme. Candidates for the nonpartisan positions touted their culture war credentials and endorsements from the state's GOP governor. Once elected, the new board members quickly set about translating their parental rights rhetoric into policy. Over the past 2 years, the board has adopted one divisive measure after another, including policies marginalizing LGBTQ students and a ban on any classroom displays that reflect personal views of teachers. The board's agenda also spawned a strong community response. A growing coalition, the Roanoke County Collaborative for Schools Our Students Deserve, has come together in opposition to the religious and ideological tenor of the board's policy direction. People are coming together to say, not our public schools, not here. One of the big lessons here is that it takes more than one group of people to really fight back. It takes all of us. Page 127, tapping into rural resistance. 2022, members of Reclaim Idaho fanned the state, gathering signatures for a ballot measure that would increase school funding by $300 million a year. The effort put them in contact with more than 100,000 voters across the gem state and ended up providing something of a wake-up call. Idahoans, especially rural residents, expressed a real concern about education culture wars and what was being taught in local public schools. And yet, that didn't translate into a loss of support for public education. We heard a lot of people talk about CRT and their concern about it, and then turn around and sign our initiative that would increase taxes in order to fund public schools. What they didn't hear voters talking about was school vouchers. Idaho was one of many states where lawmakers, bolstered by lobbyists from national school choice groups and an array of deep-pocketed donors, attempted to enact a private school voucher program in the wake of the pandemic. Unlike many other red states, the effort came up short in Idaho, in part because of the deep resistance to school privatization from rural residents. As soon as they heard a little bit about the issue and the proposal to take funding out of public schools and put it towards private school tuition, they didn't like it. On the face of it, they just thought it was a bad idea. The experience convinced Mayville that rural education is the great weakness on the far right's push to expand school vouchers. Write that down. An organizing opportunity for public education advocates. It's their Achilles heel, says Mayville. They have no answer to the basic questions that arise when you set up these statewide voucher programs that not only don't serve rural communities, but in fact siphon money out of rural communities. Bottom of page 128, teachers can't do it alone. Explains in 2018, a teacher-led revolt swept the country by storm in places like West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona. Some of the states where cuts to education spending had cut deepest. Teachers walked off the job and took to the streets. Under the hashtag slogan Red for Ed, teachers protested against the disinvestment from public education and the attacks on their profession. In the past decade, teachers and their unions have been the leading defenders of public education. Millions of organized teachers have become a force to be reckoned with. Yet we simply can't outsource the defense of public education to teachers and their unions. For one thing, unions have long been a boogeyman for those on the right. If public education is to survive the existential threat it currently faces, it can't be perceived as a project of the left. Allowing unions to do the heavy lifting might be easier for all of us. After all, organizing takes a lot of work, but doing so also allows conservative critics to paint the defense of public education as a desperate attempt by teachers to protect their own self-interest. The second major reason that we can't outsource this effort to unions is that it simply won't work. There may be millions of organized educators willing to stand up for public schools, but they aren't enough to hold back the tide. The American people themselves need to make clear, especially at the ballot box, that public education is an issue they won't budge on. These problems are not going to be resolved by teachers, unions, and politicians. It's going to take regular folks, says Heather Dubois-Bournain. Page 131, and this is a good part. They're all good parts. Relearning democracy. When Renee Seckel attempts to alert her friends and neighbors in Wake County, North Carolina, to the threats of public education, she encounters obstacles. While people there generally like their public schools and don't want to see them dismantled, they feel powerless to do anything about it. I hear a lot of complaints that all politicians are the same, said Seckel, the founder of Save Our Schools North Carolina and an organizer for Red, Wine, and Blue. It's a kind of learned helplessness that gives us an excuse not to do anything. Urging voters to speak out against harmful legislation is already a heavy lift. Asking them to believe in a system that's been corrupted by gerrymandering and dark money can feel impossible. And yet, in communities that are successfully pushing back against divisive culture war tactics and school privatization, the result is often not just the defeat of extreme candidates or bad bills. Local democracy itself emerges strengthened. Despite the horrible threats communities have to beat back, there's a silver lining. These places are different now. They've had this galvanizing episode that showed them who they are. It spurred community engagement in a new way and the way people are expected to show up. The most powerful effect of these grassroots efforts isn't merely them holding back the tide of attacks on public schools, it's watching people take control of their communities. Chapter 8, page 133, Reclaiming Education as a Public Good. All right, if you've been following the podcast and the Storytime episodes, then you are probably familiar with the episode, Houston, We Have a Problem, and his name is AJ Crabill. I guess his name is Crabill. If you haven't watched that one, I highly suggest it. But if we are going to look at the pattern, then the next major issues coming down the chain for Nevada is at the state level, at the Board of Education, Nevada State Board of Education level, where these policies would have to apply to all in Nevada, not just independent school districts, which again is the seat that I'm running for, and I'm running for one of the only 4 elected seats. The majority of that board is appointed by the governor, and we have a new governor, a governor named Joe Lombardo, who is very, very, very publicly pro-school choice, pro-vouchers. Okay, so while everybody is focused on school board races, and as they should be, I think there's a really big threat to something happening at the state level and potentially a governor making executive decisions as to who the appointees of that board are and who the superintendent of the Nevada Department of Education is. But I digress. Back to Chapter 8, Reclaiming Education as a Public Good. Arizona is in the throes of what the New York Times calls the ultimate experiment in school choice. As of 2022, every student, including those from Arizona's wealthiest families, became eligible for a school voucher. Anywhere from $7,000 to $40,000 in taxpayer funds can now be deposited into a so-called education savings account to be used for private school tuition, homeschooling, or other education-related expenses. This includes students who have never attended public schools, whose private school tuition is now being paid by the state. Proponents of the vision hold up Arizona as a triumph. Here is fund students, not systems, translated from ideology to policy. But the experiment underway in Arizona is also about radically redefining K-12 education from a public good that benefits all of us to a private good consumed by individuals. As voucher proponents argue, individual families should be able to use taxpayer funds to purchase whatever kind of schooling they want for their children with minimal oversight. We already talked earlier that it's about to cost Arizona taxpayers $1 billion a year. As Charles Seiler and Don Penich Thacker put it, Arizona has very few options to balance the budget, which leaves slashing programs and services as the only viable tool in a depleted toolbox. Privatization, in other words, begets more privatization. But what's underway in Arizona isn't merely about replacing a public system with private options. The ultimate goal is to move away from any shared responsibility for other people's children. Do you care about other people's kids or not? Says Beth Lewis, the executive director of Save Our Schools Arizona. As Lewis argues, the fight to save public schools is also a fight to save a vision of society. Do we want to live in a world based on an understanding of a public good, or one where only the individual good matters? For her, the answer is clear, and for me too. I want to live in a society where we care about other people's kids. That's what I'm fighting for. Remember, I asked you that question earlier. Did you put it in the YouTube comments? You should still do it, even though you probably will get shamed if you don't say the right thing. I'm not going to lie to you. On page 135, how did we start to think of education as a private good? To understand exactly how Americans came to see K-12 education as a private good, something that individuals do for themselves as consumers, we need a quick history lesson. We talked about common schools before, and then the real life experience of that happening is that parents sent their kids to those schools and they liked them. More families wanted in, they voted for taxes. But even as the public flocked to the new common schools, the tension between education as a common good and education as a commodity was already becoming apparent. Only a tiny minority at this point went on to earn a high school diploma. Those who did complete that schooling found that their degrees made a significant difference, signaling to employers that they had training required for a range of emerging white-collar professions. Americans began to think of schooling in a new way as a means of getting ahead. Universal taxpayer-supported schooling was initially a civic project. The aim was to ensure the kinds of basic competencies for all young people that had for so long been the exclusive preserve of the middle and upper classes. Scholar David Labery describes this purpose as the democratic equality aim of public education. That's number one. I put a 1 by that because there's 3 things to note here. Yet, as Americans began to realize the utility of school for getting ahead, what Labery calls the number 2, social mobility aim, it started to transform the way people thought of education's utility. Families soon began demanding greater access to the credentials that mattered, starting with the high school diploma. By the 1930s, roughly 7 million students were enrolled in grades 9 through 12, a tenfold increase. For the first time in U.S. history, high school graduation rates were above 50%. But as more Americans earned high school diplomas, the relative value of that credential began to decline. Then students began attending post-secondary education in ever greater numbers. In 1900, only 237,000 students were enrolled in America's 2- and 4-year colleges. By 1940, that figure had ballooned to 1.5 million. By 1950, after the GI Bill expanded access for returning veterans, there were nearly 2.5 million students enrolled in higher education, and that figure continued to double every 20 years through the end of the century. The aim of democratic equality, of course, never went away. Education continued to deliver a broad benefit at the local, state, and national level. Americans were more informed because of universal public schooling. They were better prepared for the formal and informal rigors of citizenship, and despite ongoing and systemic inequity, they were more unified. Moreover, public education produced widespread returns to the American economy, which David Labery defines as a third aim for schooling, number 3, social efficiency. Still, the social mobility aim continued to exert an ever greater influence on Americans' imaginations. That was due in no small part to messaging from their political leaders who argued that education was the best way to rise up the economic ladder and the best way to address the problem of poverty. Such rhetoric was a staple from George H.W. Bush's presidential administration through the end of the Obama years, and it had the effect of heaping unrealistic expectations upon the schools, which then fueled disappointed in their inevitable failure to address widening social and economic divisions. By the time Barack Obama took the oath of office, it was a Democratic Party mantra that education, with a particular emphasis on obtaining a college degree, was the solution for poverty and economic inequality. According to the Obama White House, earning a post-secondary degree was no longer just a pathway to opportunity for a talented few. Instead, it was now a prerequisite for the growing jobs of the new economy. Go to college or you'll be a failure was the essence of the message. Now, bottom of 139, yet expanding enrollments in higher education were beginning to erode the value of the college diploma, just as rising high school completion rates half a century earlier had reduced the relative value of that credential. One consequence was an uptick in applications to graduate schools. Another was that it began to matter more and more where you went to college. Moreover, deepening economic inequality heightened anxiety among parents about the cost of falling short. The high-stakes race to get into the right college, and perhaps the right graduate school after that, has had cascading effects across the education system and has spawned an entire industry of consultants and companies, all promising an admissions advantage. Politicians may have convinced themselves that a rising tide of education would lift all boats, but middle-class and affluent families knew better. They understood that schooling, defined this way, is what economists call a positional good. Any individual's gain must come at someone else's expense. The result is a system that increasingly separates winners from losers to disastrous effect. In his book, The Meritocracy Trap, Daniel Markovits argues that the battle for elite credentials exasperates inequality, hampers social mobility, and makes even the so-called winners of the educational arms race miserable. Today, middle-class children lose out to the rich children at school, and middle-class adults lose out to elite graduates at work. The quest to prove one's merit through education is a rigged game. It blames those who lose a competition for income and status that even when everyone plays by the rules, only the rich can win. The political fallout from this high-stakes battle for elite credentials has been profound, helping to fuel the populist revolt that ushered in the Trump era. The Democrats' hemorrhaging of working-class voters over the past 4 decades was driven in part by the college for all messaging that seemed to blame workers themselves for their downward mobility. But this race has also undermined any notion of K-12 education as something that we're in together. When one's own material interests seem to hinge on maintaining a personal advantage, it's hard to think about the public good. Page 141, why does it matter if we treat education as a private good? What difference does it make if we think about K-12 education as a private good? After all, we expect private citizens to shoulder the cost of higher education, even though it too generates benefits beyond those accrued by individuals. As historian John Zimmerman reminds us, we extol higher education as the basis of shared national prosperity and progress, then we turn around and present students and their families with the bill. The consumer mentality has also made us susceptible to increasingly extreme policy ideas. In our previous book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, we made the case that school choice advocates envision a future in which schooling is unbundled, just as cable packages have been largely replaced by a custom-assembled collection of a la carte shows and streaming apps. As it turns out, we were right. A growing number of state-funded education savings account programs now function in exactly this way, with parents encouraged to purchase their kids' schooling course by course, product by product, via an Amazon-like marketplace of education vendors. Kelly Schmidt, the CEO of microschool company Prenda, likens its business to Airbnb for education, with parents searching for customizable content options the way a would-be vacationer might look for a beach cottage. The authors continue, it's a radical vision in which schools no longer function as community institutions. And the reason that we're now vulnerable for such contorted policy is that we no longer talk about education as something that benefits all of us. Page 145. So how do we reclaim education as a public good? We can see that we are engulfed by the idea that schooling is a private good, something that individuals do for themselves, rather than a public good that advances our collective well-being. So what do we do about it? We can start by reducing the responsibility that education bears for achieving minimal social and economic security. If access to good jobs, housing, healthcare, and other essentials was fairer, we wouldn't heap such outsized economic expectations on our schools. And ironically, that would enable us to ask more from our schools. If we aren't asking them to fix our deepest social and economic inequalities, for example, we can ask them to focus on preparing kids for citizenship in a diverse democracy. Today, we measure the success of our schools mostly according to how well they advance the interest of individual consumers. What college did you get into? What job did you end up with? But imagine if they were judged instead by how well they contribute to a collective well-being. Currently, we ask schools to ameliorate the tremendous damage done by poverty, and we largely embrace the illusion that schooling alone is enough. It isn't. As a result, we not only ask our schools to do the impossible, but we blame them for failing to do it. Yet, when young people have their basic needs met, schooling becomes a much more straightforward enterprise. The best evidence of this can be found in the disparate rates of achievement and attainment that exist across schools, disparities that track very closely with demographic variables like family income. Visit enough schools, and it quickly becomes clear that systematic gaps in educational outcomes can't be explained by the innate abilities of students or by the conscientiousness of their teachers, another myth that is prevalent as it is problematic. The root issue is inequality. We haven't always regarded education as a solution to poverty. Consider the Economic Bill of Rights proposed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1940s. FDR's vision for a new social contract included the right to a useful and remunerative job that paid enough to ensure a decent living. It also included the right to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the right to live free of economic want or worry. Education made the list as part of Roosevelt's broader vision for expanding social democracy, but not merely because it was a means to an end, a way to secure economic dignity. It made the list because it was an end in itself, something that would help people lead better, richer, fuller lives. That's a vision of education that we all benefit from, and that's a vision that we need to reclaim. Now for the conclusion, page 151. This time it's different. We've been here before, yet for the first time in roughly 2 centuries, it seems plausible that our struggle against ourselves will damage the very foundations of public education. The future we fight our way into, in other words, may be one quite unlike our present or our past. Prior battles have always presumed the existence of schools that are taxpayer-supported, democratically controlled, and universally accessible. Across the generations, Americans have excluded each other from schools, denied each other equal opportunity, and kept resources out of each other's reach. We have persecuted each other in the name of our politics, religion, and culture. We have rejected each other's histories, and yet every September, the schools have opened their doors. Our current education war, however, calls into question the very existence of public schools. So many of the culture warriors who are crusading against paranoid fixations like critical race theory, they're seeking to purge rather than destroy, but they are standing in solidarity, at least in this moment, with those who are trying to destroy public education. These free market fundamentalists believe that government schools and their trappings, democratic governance, regulation, and unionization, among other problematic features, are the product of graft and incompetence. Their ultimate end goal is an entirely privatized system of schooling. For the moment, the interests of these two groups have converged. Committed market ideologues are all too happy to advance the culture war agenda. They have deep pockets, an effective policy apparatus, and well-connected political networks. Deploying themselves on the side of culture warriors, they have elevated groups like Moms for Liberty to national prominence. The group's long-term interests, however, are not the same. As culture war consumes our attention, market fundamentalists are seizing a moment of upheaval, a window of political opportunity to drive forward policies that have long lacked the appeal necessary for legislative victories. In the end, culture war isn't merely an outlet for grievance. though it is that, it is also a mechanism for alienating people. It is a way of prying allegiance away from the public schools that Americans of all stripes have long supported, and which are at the heart of so many communities. The fog of culture war always lifts, slowly at first and then all of a sudden. Transgender athletes will someday compete without controversy. America's racial history will be taught openly and honestly, and parents will give up the quest to control which books rest on library shelves. That's the nature of life in a multicultural democracy. You make peace. But what will be lost in the meantime? The flames of culture war have roared through our schools before, yet never have they threatened to be so destructive. As some activists have mounted the equivalent of a volunteer fire brigade, supporters of voucher programs have rained down a steady stream of fuel. They are acting with all deliberate speed. This is a moment that demands action, but defenders of public education must take care not to further fan the flames. The response from the political left must not be a quest for total victory over their counterparts on the right. Public education cannot become a partisan issue, supported only by half of Americans. If we are to preserve our schools, it must be clear that public education is for all of us. We must win the peace. If we fail at that, we will lose our schools. And if we lose our schools, they will not come back. That may sound like hyperbole, the authors say, but it isn't. Imagine, even in nonpartisan times, trying to sell Americans on something as ambitious as public education. It isn't just the price tag, which cost us annually the better part of $1 trillion. It's also the profoundly inclusive design. Public schools are open to all and over the past several decades have become increasingly equitable. Moreover, the schools are publicly governed, meaning that they are an ongoing experiment in democracy and self-rule. Though prospects may seem dire, it is also the case that in defending the ideal of public education, we might awaken the collective will to do more than endure. If we continue to take our schools for granted, as we have for generations, we will fail to recognize that the shape and substance of public education is a matter solely determined by us. In other words, this is not a drill. There is no time to waste. If we continue to lose our public education system at the rate that it is happening, it will never come back. We will be done. Like, stick a fork in us. We're done. Done. And that concludes the reading, book binge, narration, some of my verbiage, some of my stories of the Education Wars. Grab yourself a copy. Now you know what all the pages are. I'm going to leave you really quick with some of my thoughts, of course. This agenda seems to be unraveling one state at a time. It's usually one state getting all the attention, and my spidey senses are telling me that Nevada is next. The makeup of the state board has become appointed. Some of the school district boards have become appointed. We have a pro-school choice governor now. Things could change in the blink of an eye. We have charter authority boards funding public school board elections. We have A.J. Crabill training both the Nevada State Board of Education and the Clark County School Board. We have a chapter of Moms for Liberty that was recently formed, and their backed candidates have made it past the primary election and are on the ballot for November in both the state board and local races. Nobody seems too concerned about Nevada right now because vouchers didn't have enough interest in the past. They failed a couple times to make it past both houses. There was a charter school district that formed around 2015, the Achievement School District, but that didn't last too long. However, things are different now. If you've followed the Storytime episodes and the Jara Chronicles so far, then you know exactly how the Clark County School Board has lost its power to anti-public education superintendents and trustees, and that the community has lost faith in the publicly elected board. I believe that pro-voucher people in Nevada are laying low, and they are ready to act at a moment's notice to take over the Clark County School Board, possibly even all of Nevada school boards, and bring legislation forward for a statewide voucher program that will be more popular with voters and elected officials this time around. So we need to keep our eyes open. We need to be prepared to strike back in the same way that the students in Georgia did. And we need to take the advice given at the end of that book as to how to message all of this and how to somehow come together in a unified way that isn't related to a certain party and is in the best interest of all of us and all of our kids. And we all need to say, I care about your kids, not just my kids. Let's make public school a public good once again. Those are some of my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them in the YouTube comments or through a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Please follow and or connect with the authors through their podcast, Have You Heard? Grab your copy of Education Wars if you haven't yet. Please donate to the continued production of this show. That's at unravelingeducation.com/sponsor. You can also join a bunch of us in Nevada in rallying together to fight back on anti-public education efforts at unravelingeducation.com/fightback. Fill out that form. Share this episode on social media. Jump into conversations at the grocery store when you hear people talking about it. Get into fights with strangers on the internet, or start your own kitchen table coalition. Just do something because we don't have time to lose. Thanks again for caring. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Oh yeah, and if you're in Nevada, specifically West Clark County, vote for me on November 5th. Danielle Ford, Nevada Board of Education. Visit votedanielleford.com to learn more about the platform, volunteer for the campaign, and or make a donation. Bye-bye.